From the moment the book came into his hands, he seems to have been haunted by the fear that there might be more Avellanedas in the field, and putting everything else aside, he set himself to finish off his task and protect Don Quixote in the only way he could, by killing him. The conclusion is no doubt a hasty and in some places clumsy piece of work, and the frequent repetition of the scolding administered to Avellaneda becomes in the end rather wearisome. But it is, at any rate, a conclusion, and for that we must thank Avellaneda. The new volume was ready for the press in February, but was not printed till the very end of 1615, and during the interval Cervantes put together the comedies and interludes he had written within the last few years, and, as he adds plaintively, found no demand for among the managers, and published them with a preface, worth the book it introduces tenfold, in which he gives an account of the early Spanish stage, and of his own attempts as a dramatist. It is needless to say they were put forward by Cervantes in all good faith and full confidence in their merits. The reader, however, was not to suppose they were his last word or final effort in the drama, for he had in hand a comedy called Engaño a los Ojos, about which, if he mistook not, there would be no question. Of this dramatic masterpiece the world has no opportunity of judging. His health had been failing for some time, and he died, apparently of dropsy, on the 23rd of April, 1616, the day on which England lost Shakespeare, nominally at least, for the English calendar had not yet been reformed. He died as he had lived, accepting his lot bravely and cheerfully. Was it an unhappy life, that of Cervantes? His biographers all tell us that it was, but I must say I doubt it. It was a hard life, a life of poverty, of incessant struggle, of toil ill-paid, of disappointment, but Cervantes carried within himself the antidote to all these evils. His was not one of those light natures that rise above adversity merely by virtue of their own buoyancy. It was in the fortitude of a high spirit that he was proof against it. It is impossible to conceive Cervantes giving way to despondency or prostrated by dejection. As for poverty, it was with him a thing to be laughed over, and the only sigh he ever allows to escape him is when he says, "Happy he to whom heaven has given a piece of bread, for which he is not bound to give thanks to any but heaven itself." Add to all this his vital energy and mental activity, his restless invention and his sanguine temperament, and there will be reason enough to doubt whether his could have been a very unhappy life. He who could take Cervantes' distresses together with his apparatus for enduring them would not make so bad a bargain, perhaps, as far as happiness in life is concerned. Of his burial place nothing is known except that he was buried, in accordance with his will, in the neighboring convent of Trinitarian nuns, of which it is supposed his daughter, Isabel de Saavedra, was an inmate, and that a few years afterwards the nuns removed to another convent, carrying their dead with them. But whether the remains of Cervantes were included in the removal or not, no one knows, and the clue to their resting place is now lost beyond all hope. This furnishes perhaps the least defensible of the items in the charge of neglect brought against his contemporaries. In some of the others there is a good deal of exaggeration. To listen to most of his biographers, one would suppose that all Spain was in league not only against the man, but against his memory, or at least that it was insensible to his merits, and left him to live in misery and die of want. To talk of his hard life and unworthy employments in Andalusia is absurd. What had he done to distinguish him from thousands of other struggling men earning a precarious livelihood? True, he was a gallant soldier, who had been wounded and had undergone captivity and suffering in his country's cause. But there were hundreds of others in the same case. He had written a mediocre specimen of an insipid class of romance, and some plays which manifestly did not comply with the primary condition of pleasing. Were the playgoers to patronize plays that did not amuse them, because the author was to produce Don Quixote 20 years afterwards? The scramble for copies, which, as we have seen, followed immediately on the appearance of the book, does not look like general insensibility to its merits. No doubt it was received coldly by some, but if a man writes a book in ridicule of periwigs, he must make his account with being coldly received by the periwig wearers and hated by the whole tribe of wig-makers. If Cervantes had the chivalry romance readers, the sentimentalists, the dramatists, and the poets of the period all against him, it was because Don Quixote was what it was. And if the general public did not come forward to make him comfortable for the rest of his days, it is no more to be charged with neglect and ingratitude than the English-speaking public that did not pay off Scott's liabilities. It did the best it could. It read his book and liked it and bought it, and encouraged the bookseller to pay him well for others. It has been also made a reproach to Spain that she has erected no monument to the man she is proudest of, no monument, that is to say, of him. For the bronze statue in the little garden of the Plaza de las Cortes, a fair work of art, no doubt, and unexceptionable had it been set up to the local poet in the marketplace of some provincial town, is not worthy of Cervantes or of Madrid. But what need has Cervantes of such weak witness of his name? Or what could a monument do in his case except testify to the self-glorification of those who had put it up? Si monumentum quaeris circumspice. The nearest bookseller's shop will show what bathos there would be in a monument to the author of Don Quixote. 9 editions of the first part of Don Quixote had already appeared before Cervantes died, 30,000 copies in all, according to his own estimate, and a 10th was printed at Barcelona the year after his death. So large a number naturally supplied the demand for some time, but by 1634 it appears to have been exhausted, and from that time down to the present day the stream of editions has continued to flow rapidly and regularly. The translations show still more clearly in what request the book has been from the very outset. In 7 years from the completion of the work it had been translated into the 4 leading languages of Europe. Except the Bible, in fact, no book has been so widely diffused as Don Quixote. The Imitatio Christi may have been translated into as many different languages, and perhaps Robinson Crusoe and the Vicar of Wakefield into nearly as many, but in multiplicity of translations and editions, Don Quixote leaves them all far behind. Still more remarkable is the character of this wide diffusion. Don Quixote has been thoroughly naturalized among people whose ideas about knight-errantry, if they had any at all, were of the vaguest, who had never seen or heard of a book of chivalry, who could not possibly feel the humor of the burlesque or sympathize with the author's purpose. Another curious fact is that this, the most cosmopolitan book in the world, is one of the most intensely national. Manon Lescaut is not more thoroughly French, Tom Jones not more English, Rob Roy not more Scotch, than Don Quixote is Spanish in character, in ideas, in sentiment, in local color, in everything. What, then, is the secret of this unparalleled popularity, increasing year by year for well-nigh 3 centuries? One explanation, no doubt, is that of all the books in the world, Don Quixote is the most Catholic. There is something in it for every sort of reader, young or old, sage or simple, high or low. as Cervantes himself says with a touch of pride. It is thumbed and read and got by heart by people of all sorts. The children turn its leaves, the young people read it, the grown men understand it, the old folk praise it. But it would be idle to deny that the ingredient which, more than its humor, or its wisdom, or the fertility of invention or knowledge of human nature it displays, has ensured its success with the multitude, is the vein of farce that runs through it. It was the attack upon the sheep, the battle with the wineskins, Mambrino's helmet, the balsam of Fierabras, Don Quixote knocked over by the sails of the windmill, Sancho tossed in the blanket, the mishaps and misadventures of master and man that were originally the great attraction, and perhaps are so still to some extent with the majority of readers. It is plain that Don Quixote was generally regarded at first, and indeed in Spain for a long time, as little more than a queer, droll book, full of laughable incidents and absurd situations. Very amusing, but not entitled to much consideration or care. All the editions printed in Spain from 1637 to 1771, when the famous printer Ibarra took it up, were mere trade editions, badly and carelessly printed on vile paper and got up in the style of chapbooks intended only for popular use, with, in most instances, uncouth illustrations and claptrap additions by the publisher. To England belongs the credit of having been the first country to recognize the right of Don Quixote to better treatment than this. The London edition of 1738, commonly called Lord Carteret's, from having been suggested by him, was not a mere edition de luxe. It produced Don Quixote in becoming form, as regards paper and type, and embellished with plates which, if not particularly happy as illustrations, were at least well-intentioned and well executed. But it also aimed at correctness of text, a matter to which nobody except the editors of the Valencia and Brussels editions had given even a passing thought, and for a first attempt it was fairly successful. For though some of its emendations are inadmissible, a good many of them have been adopted by all subsequent editors. The zeal of publishers, editors, and annotators brought about a remarkable change of sentiment with regard to Don Quixote. A vast number of its admirers began to grow ashamed of laughing over it. It became almost a crime to treat it as a humorous book. The humor was not entirely denied, but according to the new view, it was rated as an altogether secondary quality, a mere accessory, nothing more than the stalking horse under the presentation of which Cervantes shot his philosophy or his satire, or whatever it was he was meant to shoot. For on this point opinions varied. All were agreed, however, that the object he aimed at was not the books of chivalry. He said emphatically in the preface to the first part, and in the last sentence of the second, that he had no other object in view than to discredit these books, and this, to advanced criticism, made it clear that his object must have been something else. One theory was that the book was a kind of allegory, setting forth the eternal struggle between the ideal and the real, between the spirit of poetry and the spirit of prose, and perhaps German philosophy never evolved a more ungainly or unlikely camel out of the depths of its inner consciousness. Something of the antagonism, no doubt, is to be found in Don Quixote, because it is to be found everywhere in life, and Cervantes drew from life. It is difficult to imagine a community in which the never-ceasing game of cross purposes between Sancho Panza and Don Quixote would not be recognized as true to nature. In the Stone Age, among the lake-dwellers, among the cavemen, there were Don Quixotes and Sancho Panzas. There must have been the troglodyte who never could see the facts before his eyes, and the troglodyte who could see nothing else. But to suppose Cervantes deliberately setting himself to expound any such idea in 2 stout quarto volumes is to suppose something not only very unlike the age in which he lived, but altogether unlike Cervantes himself, who would have been the first to laugh at an attempt of the sort made by anyone else. The extraordinary influence of the romances of chivalry in his day is quite enough to account for the genesis of the book. Whoops. Some idea of the prodigious development of this branch of literature in the 16th century may be obtained from the scrutiny of Chapter 7, if the reader bears in mind that only a portion of the romances belonging to by far the largest group are enumerated. As to its effect upon the nation, there is abundant evidence. From the time when the Amadises and Palmerans began to grow popular down to the very end of the century, there is a steady stream of invective from men whose character and position lend weight to their words, against the romances of chivalry and the infatuation of their readers. Ridicule was the only besom to sweep away that dust. That this was the task Cervantes set himself, and that he had ample provocation to urge him to it, will be sufficiently clear to those who look into the evidence. As it will be also that it was not chivalry itself that he attacked and swept away. Of all the absurdities that, thanks to poetry, will be repeated to the end of time, there is no greater one than saying that Cervantes smiled Spain's chivalry away. In the first place, there was no chivalry for him to smile away. Spain's chivalry had been dead for more than a century. Its work was done when Granada fell, and as chivalry was essentially republican in its nature, it could not live under the rule that Ferdinand substituted for the free institutions of medieval Spain. What he did smile away was not chivalry, but a degrading mockery of it. The true nature of the right arm and the bright array, before which, according to the poet, the world gave ground, and which Cervantes' single laugh demolished, may be gathered from the words of one of his own countrymen, Don Felix Pacheco, as reported by Captain George Carleton in his military memoirs from 1672 to 1713. Before the appearance in the world of that labor of Cervantes, he said, it was next to an impossibility for a man to walk the streets with any delight or without danger. There were seen so many cavaliers prancing and curvetting before the windows of their mistresses, that a stranger would have imagined the whole nation to have been nothing less than a race of knight-errants. But after the world became a little acquainted with that notable history, the man that was seen in that once celebrated drapery was pointed at as a Don Quixote, and found himself the jest of high and low. And I verily believe that to this, and this only, we owe that dampness and poverty of spirit which has run through all our councils for a century past, so little agreeable to those nobler actions of our famous ancestors. To call Don Quixote a sad book, preaching a pessimist view of life, argues a total misconception of its drift. It would be so if its moral were that, in this world, true enthusiasm naturally leads to ridicule and discomfiture. But it preaches nothing of the sort. Its moral, so far as it can be said to have one, is that the spurious enthusiasm that is born of vanity and self-conceit, that is made an end in itself, not a means to an end, that acts on mere impulse, regardless of circumstances and consequences, is mischievous to its owner, and a very considerable nuisance to the community at large. To those who cannot distinguish between the one kind and the other, no doubt Don Quixote is a sad book. No doubt, to some minds, it is very sad that a man who had just uttered so beautiful a sentiment as that "it is a hard case to make slaves of those whom God and nature made free," should be ungratefully pelted by the scoundrels his crazy philanthropy had let loose on society. But to others of a more judicial cast it will be a matter of regret that reckless self-sufficient enthusiasm is not oftener requited in some such way for all the mischief it does in the world. A very slight examination of the structure of Don Quixote will suffice to show that Cervantes had no deep design or elaborate plan in his mind when he began the book. When he wrote those lines in which, with a few strokes of a great master, he sets before us the pauper gentleman, he had no idea of the goal to which his imagination was leading him. There can be little doubt that all he contemplated was a short tale, to range with those he had already written, a tale setting forth the ludicrous results that might be expected to follow the attempt of a crazy gentleman to act the part of a knight-errant in modern life. It is plain, for one thing, that Sancho Panza did not enter into the original scheme, for had Cervantes thought of him, he certainly would not have omitted him in his hero's outfit, which he obviously meant to be complete. Him we owe to the landlord's chance remark in chapter 3 that knights seldom travelled without squires. To try to think of a Don Quixote without Sancho Panza is like trying to think of a one-bladed pair of scissors. The story was written at first, like the others, without any division and without the intervention of Cide Hamete Benengeli, and it seems not unlikely that Cervantes had some intention of bringing Dulcinea or Aldonza Lorenzo on the scene in person. It was probably the ransacking of the Don's library and the discussion on the books of chivalry that first suggested to him that his idea was capable of development. What if instead of a mere string of farcical misadventures, he were to make his tale a burlesque of one of these books, caricaturing their style, incidents, and spirit? In pursuance of this change of plan, he hastily and somewhat clumsily divided what he had written into chapters on the model of Amadis, invented the fable of a mysterious Arabic manuscript, and set up Cide Hamete Benengeli in imitation of the almost invariable practice of the chivalry romance authors, who were fond of tracing their books to some recondite source. In working out the new ideas, he soon found the value of Sancho Panza. Indeed, the keynote, not only to Sancho's part, but to the whole book, is struck in the first words Sancho utters when he announces his intention of taking his ass with him. About the ass, we are told, Don Quixote hesitated a little, trying whether he could call to mind any knight-errant taking with him a squire mounted on ass-back, but no instance occurred to his memory. We can see the whole scene at a glance, the stolid unconsciousness of Sancho and the perplexity of his master, upon whose perception the incongruity has just forced itself. This is Sancho's mission throughout the book. He is an unconscious Mephistopheles, always unwittingly making mockery of his master's aspirations, always exposing the fallacy of his ideas by some unintentional ad absurdum, always bringing him back to the world of fact and commonplace by force of sheer stolidity. By the time Cervantes had got his volume of novels off his hands, and summoned up resolution enough to set about the second part in earnest, the case was very much altered. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza had not merely found favor, but had already become what they have never since ceased to be, veritable entities to the popular imagination. There was no occasion for him now to interpolate extraneous matter. Nay, his readers told him plainly that what they wanted of him was more Don Quixote and more Sancho Panza, and not novels, tales, or digressions. To himself, too, his creations had become reality, and he had become proud of them, especially of Sancho. He began the second part, therefore, under very different conditions, and the difference makes itself manifest at once. Even in translation, the style will be seen to be far easier, more flowing, more natural, and more like that of a man sure of himself and of his audience. Don Quixote and Sancho undergo a change also. In the first part, Don Quixote has no character or individuality whatever. He is nothing more than a crazy representative of the sentiments of the chivalry romances. In all that he says and does he is simply repeating the lesson he has learned from his books, and therefore it is absurd to speak of him in the gushing strain of the sentimental critics when they dilate upon his nobleness, disinterestedness, dauntless courage, and so forth. It was the business of a knight-errant to right wrongs, redress injuries, and succour the distressed, and this, as a matter of course, he makes his business when he takes up the part. A knight-errant was bound to be intrepid, and so he feels bound to cast fear aside. Of all Byron's melodious nonsense about Don Quixote, the most nonsensical statement is that 'tis his virtue that makes him mad. The exact opposite is the truth. It is his madness makes him virtuous. In the second part, Cervantes repeatedly reminds the reader, as if it was a point upon which he was anxious there should be no mistake, that his hero's madness is strictly confined to delusions on the subject of chivalry, and that on every other subject he is discreto, one, in fact, whose faculty of discernment is in perfect order. The advantage of this is that he is enabled to make use of Don Quixote as a mouthpiece for his own reflections, and so, without seeming to digress, allow himself the relief of digression when he requires it, as freely as in a commonplace book. It is true, the amount of individuality bestowed upon Don Quixote is not very great. There are some natural touches of character about him, such as his mixture of irascibility and placability, and his curious affection for Sancho, together with his impatience of the squire's loquacity and impertinence. But in the main, apart from his craze, he is little more than a thoughtful, cultured gentleman, with instinctive good taste and a great deal of shrewdness and originality of mind. As to Sancho, it is plain, from the concluding words of the preface to the first part, that he was a favourite with his creator even before he had been taken into favour by the public. An inferior genius, taking him in hand a second time, would very likely have tried to improve him by making him more comical, clever, amiable, or virtuous. But Cervantes was too true an artist to spoil his work in this way. Sancho, when he reappears, is the old Sancho with the old familiar features, but with a difference. They have been brought out more distinctly, but at the same time, with a careful avoidance of anything like caricature. The outline has been filled in where filling in was necessary, and vivified by a few touches of a master's hand. Sancho stands before us as he might in a character portrait by Velasquez. He is a much more important and prominent figure in the second part than in the first. Indeed, it is his matchless mendacity about Dulcinea that to a great extent supplies the action of the story. His development in this respect is as remarkable as in any other. In the first part he displays a great natural gift of lying. His lies are not of the highly imaginative sort that liars in fiction commonly indulge in. Like Falstaff's, they resemble the father that begets them. They are simple, homely, plump lies, plain working lies, in short. But in the service of such a master as Don Quixote, he develops rapidly, as we see when he comes to palm off the 3 country wenches as Dulcinea and her ladies in waiting. It is worth noticing how, flushed by his success in this instance, he is tempted afterwards to try a flight beyond his powers. He is tempted afterwards to try a flight beyond his powers in his account of the journey on Clavileño. In the second part it is the spirit rather than the incidents of the chivalry romances that is the subject of the burlesque. Enchantments of the sort travestied in those of Dulcinea and the Trifaldi, and the cave of Montesinos play a leading part in the later and inferior romances, and another distinguishing feature is caricatured in Don Quixote's blind adoration of Dulcinea. In the romances of chivalry, love is either a mere animalism or a fantastic idolatry. Only a coarse-minded man would care to make merry with the former, but to one of Cervantes' humor the latter was naturally an attractive subject for ridicule. Like everything else in these romances, it is a gross exaggeration of the real sentiment of chivalry, but its peculiar extravagance is probably due to the influence of those masters of hyperbole, the Provençal poets. When a troubadour professed his readiness to obey his lady in all things, he made it incumbent upon the next comer, if he wished to avoid the imputation of tameness and commonplace, to declare himself the slave of her will, which the next was compelled to cap by some still stronger declaration. And so expressions of devotion went on rising one above the other like biddings at an auction, and a conventional language of gallantry and theory of love came into being that in time permeated the literature of southern Europe, and bore fruit, in one direction in the transcendental worship of Beatrice and Laura, and in another in the grotesque idolatry which found exponents in writers like Feliciano de Silva. This is what Cervantes deals with in Don Quixote's passion for Dulcinea, and in no instance has he carried out the burlesque more happily. By keeping Dulcinea in the background, and making her a vague, shadowy being of whose very existence we are left in doubt, he invests Don Quixote's worship of her virtues and charms with an additional extravagance, and gives still more point to the caricature of the sentiment and language of the romances. One of the great merits of Don Quixote, and one of the qualities that have secured its acceptance by all classes of readers and made it the most cosmopolitan of books, is its simplicity. There are, of course, points obvious enough to a Spanish 17th century audience which do not immediately strike a reader nowadays, and Cervantes often takes it for granted that an allusion will be generally understood which is only intelligible to a few. For example, on many of his readers in Spain, and most of his readers out of it, the significance of his choice of a country for his hero is completely lost. It would be going too far to say that no one can thoroughly comprehend Don Quixote without having seen La Mancha, but undoubtedly even a glimpse of La Mancha will give an insight into the meaning of Cervantes such as no commentator can give. Of all the regions of Spain, it is the last that would suggest the idea of romance. Of all the dull central plateau of the peninsula, it is the dullest tract. There is something impressive about the grim solitudes of Estremadura, and if the plains of Leon and Old Castile are bald and dreary, they are studded with old cities, renowned in history and rich in relics of the past. But there is no redeeming feature in the Manchegan landscape. It has all the sameness of the desert, without its dignity. The few towns and villages that break its monotony are mean and commonplace. There is nothing venerable about them. They have not even the picturesqueness of poverty. Indeed, Don Quixote's own village, Agramacilla, has a sort of oppressive respectability in the prim regularity of its streets and houses. Everything is ignoble. The very windmills are the ugliest and shabbiest of the windmill kind. To anyone who knew the country well, the mere style and title of Don Quixote of La Mancha gave the key to the author's meaning at once. La Mancha, as the knight's country and scene of his chivalries, is of a piece with the pasteboard helmet, the farm labourer on assback for a squire. Knighthood conferred by a rascally ventero, convicts taken for victims of oppression, and the rest of the incongruities between Don Quixote's world and the world he lived in, between things as he saw them and things as they were. It is strange that this element of incongruity, underlying the whole humour and purpose of the book, should have been so little heeded by the majority of those who have undertaken to interpret Don Quixote. It has been completely overlooked, for example, by the illustrators. To be sure, the great majority of the artists who illustrated Don Quixote knew nothing whatever of Spain. To them a venta conveyed no idea but the abstract one of a roadside inn, and they could not therefore do full justice to the humour of Don Quixote's misconception in taking it for a castle, or perceive the remoteness of all its realities from his ideal. But even when better informed, they seem to have no apprehension of the full force of the discrepancy. Take, for instance, Gustave Doré's drawing of Don Quixote watching his armour in the inn-yard. Whether or not the Venta de Quesada on the Sevilla road is, as tradition maintains, the inn described in Don Quixote, beyond all question it was just such an inn-yard as the one behind it that Cervantes had in his mind's eye, and it was on just such a rude stone trough as that beside the primitive draw-well in the corner that he meant Don Quixote to deposit his armour. Gustave Doré makes it an elaborate fountain, such as no arriero ever watered his mules at in the corral of any venta in Spain, and thereby entirely misses the point aimed at by Cervantes. It is the mean, prosaic, commonplace character of all the surroundings and circumstances that gives a significance to Don Quixote's vigil and the ceremony that follows. Cervantes' humour is for the most part of that broader and simpler sort, the strength of which lies in the perception of the incongruous. It is the incongruity of Sancho in all his ways, words, and works, with the ideas and aims of his master, quite as much as the wonderful vitality and truth to nature of the character, that makes him the most humorous creation in the whole range of fiction. That unsmiling gravity of which Cervantes was the first great master, Cervantes' serious air, which sits naturally on Swift alone, perhaps, of later humorists, is essential to this kind of humour, and here again Cervantes has suffered at the hands of his interpreters. Nothing, unless indeed the coarse buffoonery of Phillips, could be more out of place in an attempt to represent Cervantes than a flippant, would-be facetious style, like that of Motteux's version, for example, or the sprightly, jaunty air French translators sometimes adopt. It is the grave matter-of-factness of the narrative, and the apparent unconsciousness of the author that he is saying anything ludicrous, anything but the merest commonplace, that give its peculiar flavour to the humour of Cervantes. His, in fact, is the exact opposite of the humour of Sterne and the self-conscious humorists. Even when Uncle Toby is at his best, you are always aware of the man Sterne behind it, watching you over his shoulder to see what effect he is producing. Cervantes always leaves you alone with Don Quixote and Sancho. He and Swift and the great humorists always keep themselves out of sight, or, more properly speaking, never think about themselves at all, unlike our latter-day school of humorists, who seem to have revived the old horse-collar method, and try to raise a laugh by some grotesque assumption of ignorance, imbecility, or bad taste. It is true that to do full justice to Spanish humour in any other language is well nigh an impossibility. There is a natural gravity and a sonorous stateliness about Spanish, be it ever so colloquial, that makes an absurdity doubly absurd, and gives plausibility to the most preposterous statement. This is what makes Sancho Panza's drollery the despair of the conscientious translator. Sancho's curt comments can never fall flat, but they lose half their flavor when transferred from their native Castilian into any other medium. But if foreigners have failed to do justice to the humor of Cervantes, they are no worse than his own countrymen. Indeed, were it not for the Spanish peasant's relish of Don Quixote, one might be tempted to think that the great humorist was not looked upon as a humorist at all in his own country. The craze of Don Quixote seems, in some instances, to have communicated itself to his critics, making them see things that are not in the book and run full tilt at phantoms that have no existence, save in their own imaginations. Like a good many critics nowadays, they forget that screams are not criticism, and that it is only vulgar tastes that are influenced by strings of superlatives, three-piled hyperboles, and pompous epithets. But what strikes one as particularly strange is that while they deal in extravagant eulogies, and ascribe all manner of imaginary ideas and qualities to Cervantes, they show no perception of the quality that 99 out of 100 of his readers would rate highest in him, and hold to be the one that raises him above all rivalry. To speak of Don Quixote as if it were merely a humorous book would be a manifest misdescription. Cervantes at times makes it a kind of commonplace book for occasional essays and criticisms, or for the observations and reflections and gathered wisdom of a long and stirring life. It is a mine of shrewd observation on mankind and human nature. Among modern novels there may be, here and there, more elaborate studies of character, but there is no book richer in individualized character. What Coleridge said of Shakespeare in Minimus is true of Cervantes. He never, even for the most temporary purpose, puts forward a lay figure. There is life and individuality in all his characters, however little they may have to do, or however short a time they may be before the reader. Samson Carrasco, the curate, Teresa Panza, Altisidora, even the two students met on the road to the cave of Montesinos, all live and move and have their being. And it is characteristic of the broad humanity of Cervantes that there is not a hateful one among them all. Even poor Meritones, with her deplorable morals, has a kind heart of her own and some faint and distant resemblance to a Christian about her. And as for Sancho, though on dissection we fail to find a lovable trait in him, unless it be a sort of dog-like affection for his master, who is there that in his heart does not love him? But it is, after all, the humor of Don Quixote that distinguishes it from all other books of the romance kind. It is this that makes it, as one of the most judicial-minded of modern critics calls it, the best novel in the world beyond all comparison. It is its varied humor, ranging from broad farce to comedy as subtle as Shakespeare's or Molière's, that has naturalized it in every country where there are readers, and made it a classic in every language that has a literature. Military Memoirs from 1672 to 1713. This book, it may be as well to remind some readers, is not, as it is still often described, one of Defoe's novels, but the genuine experiences of an English officer in Spain during the Succession War. The best novel in the world beyond all comparison. I am going through Don Quixote again, and admire it more than ever. It is certainly the best novel in the world beyond all comparison. Macaulay, Life and Letters.